I was never fully able to understand why does he think that China should be contained and not the United States, even if by his theory that the great powers would always conflict. Why is it the United States not to be contained rather than the other way around?
大家好，我是老吴。之前我们做过一期节目，聊过印度理性哥对话美国著名学者约翰·米尔斯海默。当时理性哥提出了不少犀利的问题，特别是针对米尔斯海默关于美国在亚洲的角色，以及为什么要遏制中国的观点，提出了很多质疑。今天这期节目里，理性哥的身份变了，他不再是主持人，而是被采访的嘉宾。不过他谈的主题还是绕不开中美关系这个核心。这次他不只是提问，而是更系统、更深入地回应和反驳了米尔斯海默的美国中心论和遏制中国论。他从历史、地缘政治、经济，还有西方中心主义的惯性思维等角度，分析为什么他认为米尔斯海默的判断存在盲点。他还指出，美国把自己当成亚洲警察，其实反而加剧了地区的紧张。他谈到，即使像美国这样强势的国家要全面遏制中国，也面临来自国内金融市场和精英阶层的强大阻力。接下来我们就一起来听听这位来自印度的理性哥是怎么剖析当前复杂的国际局势。
I want to come back to this interview you did with John Mearsheimer, because one of the things that I liked very much is that you pushed back. I mean, you focused on a point that I believe John Mearsheimer, who again I must say is a person I respect very highly, because I perceive him as very intellectually honest in the way that he sticks to his theories, and also that he has the courage, for instance, to write an entire book and stand behind the Israel lobby. I mean, this just deserves a lot of praise. But at the same time, he seems to have this somewhat blind spot when it comes to China or to India, which you were working on and pushed him on. What was your main takeaway from that discussion you had with him?
Yeah, I think the key point on that section, I mean, it was a long interview covering different segments, but the segment you were talking about, I think the key difference is this. Does the presence of the United States in Asia create a larger polarization that escalates border conflicts or disputed territorial conflicts into a much bigger conflict of strategic interests? Or is it that these Asian states are not acceptable to each other, perpetually at war with each other, and it is the United States that comes in and try to create some effectively a policing order in the region? And I think we took two different positions. Our position was that, and we discussed some of the cases. We discussed India and China. We discussed the Taiwan case, which is completely different. And we briefly discussed Japan, but we were not able to go into great detail. But our position is that even if China and Japan have conflicts over the Senkaku Islands or the Oahu Islands, that doesn't mean that they can coexist. What is a bigger impediment is the stationing of 50,000 troops at Okinawa, at multiple other bases in Japan. And it's not just Japan. It's in Korea. It's going all the way down into Philippines, including Guam, and or even down in Thailand. There are multiple bases that the United States maintain, which contains more than 100,000 in United States armed personnel, and that is creating huge encirclement, and that is escalating these conflicts. And the reason we say that is that in Central Asia, where the United States footprints is much lower, and which were used to be equally contentious, China and the Central Asian states have been able to resolve those disputes much more peacefully. And John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer, had a different view. He thinks that somehow these Asian states cannot manage their conflict on their own. And so the United States should be there as a police state. And that would also lead to his idea of containing China. And I was never fully able to understand why does he think that China should be contained and not the United States, even if by his theory that the great powers would always conflict. Why is it the United States not to be contained rather than the other way around? I mean, except from a nationalist cause. I was never able to understand. But that was, as I see, was the crux of our conflict.
Yeah, if I understand him correctly, then his answer would probably be that no, if China had the power, it would try to contain the United States, but because it doesn't, it's in the United States' best interest. But this is where I disagree with him as well.
But why do we favor? But then the question is, why do we favor the United States? I mean, even if that's another piece of the debate, there is no evidence that China would try to contain, forget United States. I mean, look at the history of Japan and China. I mean, in 1,000 years of history, China never conquered Japan. Japanese expansion goes way back into 1590s, and then massively from 1894, when the Sino-Japanese War led to Japanese takeover of Taiwan, China. Then again in 1931, it invaded Northeast China, took over Manchuria and established the Manchukuo. Again, it invaded in 1937. And then we entered the era of Cold War, where it was directly absorbed into the part of the US empire. So that's a different discussion whether we have any evidence that China would try to contain. But my question is, even if there is an evidence, there is no evidence. I don't think that would happen. We are living at an age of extreme nationalism. I mean, imagine talks about taking over an airport in Uganda because some of the debt payments were unable to be returned, led to massive uproar against it, and the Chinese had to back down. And you think about China invading Japan. I mean, it's just ridiculous beyond belief to even think about that in this age of hyper-nationalism. But the question remains that even if you thought that China would try to contain the United States, why is it a right position to say that we should favor United States containing China rather than China containing United States? I have to say that you have to have two lines of argument. Either you say that I am nationalist, or American nationalist, or you say that I feel the US system is better than the Chinese system.
Yeah,
and I think it's weak on either ground.
No, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I don't share that point of his. Of course. What I believe is that he doesn't think about it in terms of which one is better or worse, but which one out of the power dynamics makes most sense for those states. So it's not. I don't think it's a moral prescription. I think it's that he said that he thinks this is the most rational way for the United States to approach China, because not engaging with China from his theory isn't possible for a great power. So somehow you need to interact, right? I mean, it's unthinkable that these two completely, stop and seize all and any connections. But the blind spot I do see is also that the way that this was framed, right, as China's rise being ultimately a mistake of United States foreign policy of letting China rise. This is something that I also encounter a lot in Europe, and I just wonder about your view on that. That the Europeans and Euro-Americans, they see everything as a factor, an outcome of their doing. Can India and China and others maybe at some point push back against this perception?
I mean, they've been pushing back against this perception. I mean, there is a long history of that, starting from anti-colonial resistance movements and so on. And even during the post-colonial years, these countries have been saying that don't lecture us. If you have to listen to us, offer any constructive suggestions if you like. But that's about it. Get out of here. But I think it's a mindset of lecturing people. On the point that the United States allowed China to rise is there is a long history one has to get into, but I think it's misplaced. China played an equally important role in allowing greater growth in the United States. And that came at the expense of the Europeans. I mean, growth in the post-1990s phase in Europe slowed down precisely because China rose. I mean, it's more complicated than that because German industries were also clocking greater growth because they exported a lot of machineries and parts initially. I mean, now some of them have been replaced by Chinese production themselves. But by and large, growth in the neoliberal phase in Europe slowed down because there was an interlocking between the United States and China. But it also allowed the United States to maintain its hegemony because of the rise of its financial power. So in the 1990s, the early 1990s, the U.S. banks were very small. The U.S. banks, in fact, were very local in nature. It was in 1994, the Real-Legals Interstate Banking and Branching Act was passed that allowed the local banks to now go national and get bigger. And all of that culminates in 1991, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall, which allowed the commercial banks now to merge with the investment banks and the insurance companies, which led to the rise of all these massive, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Citibank groups, and so on and so forth, that dominated the globe. And it's not just the banks, it's also the non-banking institutes. So as late as 1993, there never existed a significant alternative asset management class. So there was no active venture capital market. There was no active hedge fund managers. And the private equity. So we see a tremendous rise of the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, the different Citadel LLC, this hedge fund managers, private equity, the venture capital in Silicon, precisely because they were able to over-financialize. And part of the reason they were able to over-financialize is that Chinese exports of capital, which meant that all the reserve assets of China was plugged into the treasury market, which meant that the United States could cheaply borrow from the international market, which allowed it to push back the interest rates. If not for the lowering of those interest rates, the financial power couldn't have expanded and couldn't have dominated the world. Maybe we wouldn't have had the global financial crisis. That's a different counterfactual. But you wouldn't have seen the $10 trillion asset manager like BlackRock, $10 trillion asset manager like Vanguard, huge, corporate entities like the Magnificent Seven and so on and so forth. Without this transformation, where export of cheaper Chinese goods kept inflation lower, which meant that Fed could keep on pushing interest rates lower, and the U.S. could have this unusual borrowing, which allowed it to have so much of fiscal stimulus, which the Europeans couldn't have it. And the part of the region that European growth slowed down was, of course, they couldn't dominate finance like the United States did. But the other side is that they couldn't rely on fiscal stimulus the way United States could did. And the United States could do that because of its easy access to foreign reserves coming from China and the cheaper goods coming from China. So this is just so ridiculous to say that we allowed China. Even if you allowed to rise, you allowed it to rise because it was in your interest. You became the financial power of the world through which now the domination was possible instead of domination through industrial goods.
This perception, though, is something that I do believe will stay for the foreseeable future in the United States and Europe, and somehow the rest of the world needs to deal with the fact that these two entities are so or these two spaces of world politics are so self-absorbed. Now, like from the analysis you just did, what are your thoughts on the current approach of the United States of taking a sledgehammer and basically kicking away the fundaments that it built itself in global financial markets? What's your take?
I mean, where this would lead to, it's hard to predict because there are so many different conflicts, and which side win it's hard to estimate. But we can say this, that this is part of the strategy to contain China. The writing is very clear that China is rising very rapidly, and it is becoming an alternative to U.S. hegemony. And the rise of China is very different from the rise of Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was much more contained. Its role in the international sphere was very different in the realm of politics. Economically speaking, the success of the Soviet Union was limited to its domestic spheres. But that's not China. China is creating alternative payment system, alternative social media, alternative investment patterns. Of course, it is a leader in trade and industry. And so it does create a huge challenge. Some of the challenges are, of course, misunderstood. For instance, I don't think there is Chinese would ever be able to challenge the United States in financial power, because you don't have a financial class in China altogether, because the stock market is heavily repressed through massive share of the state financial institutions. Even you don't have these hedge fund managers and the private equity players and so on. That is controlled. The top tier of the Brodelian sphere of anti-market OPEC top tier of capital is controlled by the state very heavily. And so they don't have these alternatives. But in terms of real infrastructure, they do have these alternatives. So I think why we are seeing this is very clear. It is to contain China. But to say where it would lead to is very difficult, because there are just so many conflicts of interest. I mean, the reason why a massive mandate through which Trump came to power, even he was forced into putting his aggressive tariff wars into cold storage with the rest of the world, was because the bond vigilantes had responded very reactively. And no one is above them. Even President Trump came out and said that I was listening to the bond market. It's a tough spot. They're very hard to contain. I mean, bond vigilantes are saying that, look, PIMCO and others, and we don't know, big players in the London market, also the central banks in China. I mean, a 50 basis point rise in the interest rate, 10-year treasury yield, which happened for the first time in many years, means billions and billions of dollars in even $2 trillion that the United States needs in terms of budgetary deficits every year. Forget about the trillions of dollars, 130% of GDP of debt that it already has, which means that a rise in its treasury yield means just so much more than the caricature that Elon Musk and the Doge are doing of saving like maybe 100 billion or 60 billion. I mean, their numbers keep on changing, but they are just peanuts. A rise in 10 basis points in the treasury yield would more than compensate all these efforts. So you cannot overstep. You cannot go beyond the bounds of the bond vigilantes. And then there is an equal component within the stock market. I mean, hedge fund managers and others, Ken Griffin from Citadel LLC are now openly saying that it's just so stupid. And they were Republican donors. They said that this is just so stupid. We cannot bring back manufacturing the way we are talking about, because there are multiple surveys that show that the Americans don't want to do some of the jobs that the Chinese would do, because there is just different levels of income. And even multinational corporations, NVIDIA and Apple, they're extremely reliant on their operations in China, to Taiwan in China. And they are not very happy about that. And finally, the donor class. The donor class in the tech sector that heavily invested in Trump campaign. Trillions of assets are being wiped off because of the uncertainty created by this. And they would not be happy if this continues. I mean, Elon Musk's net worth has dropped by 25%. I mean, he might be happy because he is given extra business perks, but others would not be happy. So if the assets of the donor class don't bounce back, it might be the case that there would be a business coup against Trump, and Trump would be dislodged from power, starting with the midterm 2 years from now, and then eventually he has to go. He has to be replaced by the Democrats or whoever, which would be the interest of these elites.
好，刚才就是印度理性哥的一些精彩观点。他明确指出，把亚洲的紧张局势归咎于亚洲国家自己搞不定，再把美国的介入说成是维持稳定。这种说法其实忽视了一个关键问题：美国的军事存在本身就是很多紧张的来源之一。他还通过中亚的例子反过来说明，有时候在美国影响较弱的地区，反而更容易达成和平解决。更有意思的是，他一针见血地指出了西方中心主义的惯性，总觉得世界上发生的变化都是自己造成的。他也反驳了美国允许中国崛起这种荒诞的说法，强调中美其实是高度依赖的经济伙伴关系。最后，他从美国自身的经济和政治现实出发，分析了为什么美国想要全面遏制中国，其实也面临很多国内的掣肘。好，今天的节目就分享到这里，感谢大家的收看，我们下次再见。